The ground didn't just tremble, it shattered. 500 heavy Harley-Davidsons roared into the dust-choked trailer park like a chrome-plated apocalypse. 14-year-old Liam stood frozen, convinced the notorious Hells Angels had come to destroy what little he had left. Instead, they had come to change his life forever. The Mojave Desert does not forgive, and the town of Barstow, California, was nothing more than a sun-bleached monument to that harsh reality. For 14-year-old Liam Davies, the desert heat was a constant, suffocating weight. But it wasn't the heat that kept him awake at night. It was the numbers. $800 for rent, $400 for his mother's insulin, $32 in his worn denim pocket. Liam lived in a rusting, single-wide trailer in the forgotten corner of a park, managed by a man named Thomas Gable. Gable was a man who smelled perpetually of stale cigars and cheap cologne, a landlord who viewed his tenants not as people, but as numbers on a ledger. And Liam's numbers were deeply in the red. Since Liam's father, a long-haul trucker and weekend mechanic, had passed away 3 years prior in a pile-up on Interstate 15, Liam and his mother, Annie, had been in a slow, agonizing freefall. To escape the oppressive silence of their trailer and the sight of his mother trying to hide her tears, Liam spent his afternoons at the rusted-out shell of Pete's Service Station, just off Route 66. It had been abandoned for a decade, but for a boy with a wrench and his father's grease-stained manual, it was a sanctuary. Liam would scavenge forgotten parts, clean them up, and try to sell them for a few dollars to passing motorists. It was a blistering Tuesday afternoon, the asphalt shimmering with mirages, when the thunder rolled in. It wasn't a rainstorm. It was the distinct, guttural roar of a heavy V-twin engine tearing down the highway. But the roar was sick. It sputtered, coughed violently, and let out a deafening backfire before dying completely. Liam watched from the shade of the old gas pumps as a massive motorcycle coasted onto the gravel shoulder. It was a customized 1998 Dyna Superglide, painted a menacing matte black. The rider who stepped off the bike was equally intimidating. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with a beard that reached his chest, arms heavily sleeved in faded tattoos, and a leather vest adorned with the unmistakable red and white death's head patch of the Hells Angels. The man kicked the dirt in frustration, swearing loudly as he pulled a cell phone from his pocket, only to scowl at the screen. Dead Zone. Liam hesitated. He knew the reputation of the club. Everyone in Barstow did. The local news painted them as ruthless outlaws, ghosts of the highway who operated by their own violent code. But Liam also saw a man stranded in 105-degree heat, kicking the primary cover of his bike in absolute desperation. Wiping his greasy hands on his jeans, Liam stepped out of the shade. "Hey, mister," Liam called out, his voice cracking slightly before he steadied it. The biker spun around, his eyes narrowing under the brim of his helmet. "What do you want, kid? I ain't got spare change, and I ain't in the mood to entertain." The name tape on his leather vest read, John. "I don't want your money," Liam said, stepping closer, his eyes locked on the smoking engine. "Your bike. It sounds like she's starving for fuel, but the backfire means she's running rich when she does catch. You've got a flooded carburetor, probably a cracked fuel line letting air in, messing with the vacuum." John blinked, looking from the boy to his bike, then back to the boy. He let out a harsh bark of laughter. "You a mechanic now, Junior?" "My dad was," Liam said, quietly, pulling a flathead screwdriver and a small wrench from his back pocket. "I know Harleys, especially older Evos and twin cams. Let me look. If I break it worse, you can hit me." John stared at the kid's sheer audacity. He sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Knock yourself out, kid. Name's John. Don't touch the paint." For the next hour, Liam worked in the unforgiving sun. His hands, small but nimble, moved with practiced precision. He removed the air cleaner, exposing the carburetor. Just as he suspected, the primary fuel line had dry rotted in the desert heat, cracking right at the clamp. Furthermore, the float needle was stuck, flooding the bowl. Liam sprinted back to his scavenged stash behind the gas station, returning with a length of high-pressure braided hose he had pulled from a wrecked Chevy truck a week prior, and a handful of slightly rusted but functional clamps. John watched in silence, leaning against a rusted yield sign. He watched the kid burn his knuckles on the hot exhaust, watched him wipe sweat from his eyes, and watched him work with a reverence that most grown men didn't possess. "All right," Liam finally gasped, stepping back and wiping his hands on a rag. "Give her a try. Give it a little throttle, but don't dump it." John threw his heavy leg over the saddle, turned the ignition, and hit the starter. The bike cranked twice, choked for a half-second, and then roared to life with a steady, thumping idle that shook the ground. The engine purred perfectly. John revved it twice, flawless. The hardened biker shut the bike off and stared at Liam. He reached into his thick leather wallet and pulled out a crisp, folded $100 bill. He held it out. "You got a gift, kid. Take it." Liam looked at the money. $100 was a fortune. It was groceries for 2 weeks. It was a dent in the rent. His hand twitched. But then he remembered the stories his father used to tell him about the Brotherhood of the road. "Keep it," Liam said, forcing himself to step back. John frowned, clearly insulted. "I don't take charity, kid, especially not from someone wearing shoes with holes in them." "It's not charity," Liam replied, looking the giant man dead in the eye. "My dad rode an old shovelhead. He told me you never leave a rider stranded in the desert, and you never charge a man just for getting him back on 2 wheels. Consider it paying a debt to my old man." John studied Liam for a long, silent moment. The hostility drained from his eyes, replaced by a deep, analyzing respect. He slowly put the money away. "What's your name, boy?" "Liam. Liam Davies." "Liam Davies," John repeated, committing it to memory. He fired up the bike, the roar echoing off the empty desert landscape. "You're a good man, Liam. The road remembers things like this." With a final nod, John dumped the clutch and tore off down Route 66, leaving Liam alone in the dust. As the adrenaline faded, reality crashed back down on Liam. He had just turned down $100. His mother was going to cry tonight over the bills. He walked back to the trailer park, his chest tight with the devastating realization that pride couldn't pay the rent. 3 days later, the consequences of Liam's poverty arrived at his doorstep. Thomas Gable stood on the warped wooden porch of Liam's trailer, sweating profusely in a cheap suit, flanked by a local sheriff's deputy. Annie Davies stood in the doorway, pale and shaking, clutching her worn bathrobe around her shoulders. "I've given you a month's grace period, Annie," Gable said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy that made Liam's blood boil. "The owners want this lot cleared. You have exactly 48 hours. By Friday at noon, if you don't have the $800, I'm changing the locks and your things go on the curb. Deputy Miller here is just serving the official notice." The deputy handed Annie a piece of yellow paper, looking down at his boots, clearly uncomfortable with his duty. "Sorry, ma'am. Law's the law." When they left, Annie collapsed onto the faded floral sofa, burying her face in her hands. Liam stood in the center of the tiny living room, a terrifying sense of helplessness washing over him. It was his fault. If he had taken the biker's money, maybe he could have negotiated with Gable. Desperation breeds reckless decisions. That afternoon, Liam went into his mother's room and opened the small wooden box on her dresser. Inside rested his father's silver pocket watch. It was a beautiful, heavy antique, the only thing of actual value they owned. His father had told him it was worth at least $500. Heart pounding with guilt, Liam walked 3 miles into town to Earl's Pawn and Auto. Earl Higgins was a notorious local vulture, a man who preyed on the desperate addicts and broken families of Barstow. Liam placed the watch on the glass counter. "I need $500 for this, Mr. Higgins. It's solid silver." "Antique." Earl picked it up with stained fingers, popped the back with a jeweler's tool, and laughed a wet, wheezing laugh. "500? Kid, this mechanism is shot. Best I can do is scrap weight. $40. "40?" Liam choked, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. "My dad said—" "I don't care what a dead man said," Earl interrupted callously, slapping 2 20s on the counter. "Take it or leave it. I got a business to run." Defeated, crushed by the weight of the town's cruelty, Liam took the $40. He walked home in a daze. It wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. They were going to be homeless. Thursday passed in a blur of packing. They placed their meager belongings into trash bags and cardboard boxes. The local news droned in the background, offering a bizarre distraction. The radio broadcasters were frantic. A massive rally of the Hells Angels was moving through San Bernardino County, heading east. Police forces in neighboring towns were on high tactical alert. Local businesses in Barstow were boarding up their windows, terrified of the impending invasion. Friday morning arrived with an oppressive, stifling heat. The clock ticked mercilessly toward noon. At exactly 11:45 a.m., a pickup truck crunched onto the gravel of the trailer park. Thomas Gable stepped out, smoking his signature cigar, accompanied by 2 large men wearing work gloves. Deputy Miller pulled up behind them in his cruiser, his lights flashing briefly to signal his official presence. "Time's up, Annie," Gable shouted toward the closed door. "Boys, go start pulling the boxes out." Liam stood on the porch, a heavy iron tire iron gripped tightly in his trembling hands. He was 14, skinny and terrified, but he stepped in front of the door, blocking the movers. "You don't touch our stuff," Liam yelled, his voice echoing across the silent trailer park. Neighbors peeked out from behind their blinds, too afraid to intervene. Gable sighed, rolling his eyes. "Deputy, remove the kid before I have him pressed for assault." Deputy Miller unclipped his radio, stepping forward. "Son, put the iron down. You're just going to make this harder on your mum." "We just need 1 more week," Liam pleaded, tears finally spilling over his dirt-smudged cheeks. "Please, we have nowhere to go." "Not my problem," Gable sneered, taking a step up the stairs. "Move, you little rat." Then the air shifted. It started as a low vibration, a frequency that Liam felt in the soles of his shoes before he actually heard it. The loose tin skirting of the trailer began to rattle. Gable stopped midway up the stairs, frowning. He looked up at the cloudless desert sky, thinking it was a low-flying jet from the nearby military base. But the sound didn't come from above. It came from Route 66. The low vibration swelled into a deafening, earth-shaking roar. Deputy Miller turned toward the highway, his face draining of all color. He instinctively rested his hand on his holster, taking a hurried step backward. Turning off the main highway, tearing through the dust and gravel like a conquering army, came a literal sea of motorcycles. Black leather, chrome flashing violently in the midday sun, and the terrifying, unified thunder of 500 engines running rich and loud. Gable's cigar fell from his mouth, landing on the dirt. The 2 movers froze, dropping the empty boxes they were holding. The bikers didn't just pass by the trailer park. They turned into it. They poured into the narrow dirt roads of the park, a seemingly endless river of heavy machinery. They filled the empty lots. They parked on the dying grass. They blocked the exits. The sheer volume of the noise was paralyzing. Every biker wore the winged death's head on their back. Deputy Miller was backing away, speaking frantically into his shoulder radio, calling for immediate backup, reporting a massive gang incursion. The sea of bikes parted slightly right in front of Liam's lot. The roar idled down to a heavy, rhythmic heartbeat that filled the air with the smell of exhaust and hot oil. From the front of the pack, a single motorcycle rolled forward, stopping just inches from Thomas Gable's expensive leather shoes. It was a matte black 1998 Dyna Super Glide. The giant rider kicked the stand down and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than the noise had been. The man took off his helmet, revealing the scarred, bearded face that Liam had seen 3 days ago at the abandoned gas station. John Callahan looked at the eviction notice in Gable's trembling hand, then looked at Liam, who was still gripping the tire iron on the porch. John smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach his eyes. "Looks to me," John said, his voice carrying clearly across the dead silent yard, "like my friend Liam is having a bit of a landlord problem." The silence that blanketed the dirt lot was heavier than the Mojave heat. 500 engines clicked and pinged as they cooled, sending waves of heat distorting the air above the chrome pipes. To the terrified residents peeking through their faux wood blinds, it looked like an invading army. To Thomas Gable, the greasy-haired landlord clutching an eviction notice, it looked like the end of the world. Deputy Miller's hand was still hovering over his sidearm, trembling visibly. His shoulder radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice tinny and frantic in the quiet. "Unit 4, be advised. State troopers are establishing a perimeter on Highway 66. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Command is advising to observe only." John Callahan, the giant biker Liam had helped 3 days prior, stood perfectly still. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his hands. He simply stared at Gable with eyes as cold and flat as a frozen lake. This is private property," Gable stammered, though his voice lacked any of the venom it had possessed just moments before. He took a small step back, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the dry earth. "You men are trespassing. We are conducting a legal eviction." "A legal eviction," John repeated, the words rolling off his tongue like a foul taste. He took a deliberate step forward. The sheer physical mass of the man was overwhelming. "For a woman and a 14-year-old boy, over $800. "It's business," Gable squeaked, looking desperately toward Deputy Miller for support. But Miller had taken another 2 steps back, keeping his distance from the confrontation. The 2 movers who had accompanied Gable were already edging toward their pickup truck, wanting absolutely no part of this. From the center of the massive pack of motorcycles, another heavy V-twin engine fired up, rumbling with a deep, authoritative bass. The sea of black leather and chrome parted flawlessly, respectfully, as a single rider slowly navigated through the crowd. This man was older, his beard entirely silver, his face mapped with deep lines and a jagged scar that ran from his left ear to his collarbone. He wore a patch over his heart that simply read, "President." The man killed his engine and stepped off. He walked with a heavy limp, his heavy engineer boots kicking up dust. He moved to stand beside John, looking down at Gable. "Name's Jim Lawson," the older man rasped, his voice sounding like gravel caught in a meat grinder. "Most call me Big Jim. I run the San Bernardino charter of this club, and I hear you're the man trying to throw Arthur Davies' widow onto the street." Gable swallowed hard. "I don't know any Arthur Davies. The lease is under Annie Davies, and she's a month behind on rent. I have the legal right." "You have a piece of paper," Big Jim interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "We have 500 brothers who decided to take a scenic ride through Barstow today." Big Jim turned his back to Gable, completely dismissing the landlord, and looked at Liam. The boy was still standing on the porch, the heavy iron tire iron gripped so tightly in his hands that his knuckles were stark white. He was shaking, not from the heat, but from the sheer, overwhelming adrenaline coursing through his slight frame. "Put the iron down, son," Big Jim said gently. "You're safe now. Nobody is touching your things." Liam slowly lowered the tire iron, the heavy metal clanking against the wooden porch. His mother, Annie, was standing in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "John," Big Jim called out without turning around. "Pass the helmet." John Callahan unbuckled his black, battered half-helmet and held it upside down. He reached into his thick leather vest, pulled out a wad of cash, and dropped a handful of $100 bills into it. He then passed it to a heavily tattooed biker next to him, a man whose name tape read Wrench. Wrench dropped in a fistful of 20s and passed it back. The helmet moved through the front lines of the crowd. Men in dirty denim and heavy leather dug into their pockets, wallets, and saddlebags. Hundreds, 50s, 20s, crumpled 10s. They all fluttered into the black fiberglass bowl. In less than 2 minutes, the helmet made its way back to John, overflowing with green paper. John walked up to the porch, ignoring the terrified landlord, and stopped in front of Annie. He held out the helmet. "Ma'am," John said respectfully, taking off his sunglasses. "My apologies for the noise. We came to settle a debt." Annie looked at the money, completely overwhelmed. I can't take this. I don't know who you people are." "Liam, what did you do?" "He didn't do anything wrong, Mrs. Davies," Big Jim said, limping up to the base of the stairs. "He fixed John's bike the other day. But that's just the half of it." The boy refused payment. Said his daddy taught him better than to leave a rider stranded. Said his daddy's name was Arthur. Big Jim turned back to Gable, who was now sweating so profusely his cheap suit was stained dark under the arms. "Landlord," Big Jim barked. Gable flinched. "Come here." Gable hesitated, looking at Deputy Miller, who simply shook his head as if to say, "You're on your own, buddy." Gable slowly walked over. Big Jim reached into the helmet, pulled out a massive, uncounted stack of bills, and shoved it hard against Gable's chest. Gable fumbled to catch it before the money hit the dirt. "Count it," Big Jim ordered. Gable's trembling fingers worked through the cash. It's over $4,000 here." "Good," Big Jim nodded. "Rent is $800 a month. That's 5 months paid in advance, plus a late fee. Now, you're going to pull a pen out of that cheap jacket. You're going to turn around, and you're going to use the hood of the deputy's cruiser to write a legally binding receipt. You will state that Annie Davies is paid in full for the next half year, and that her eviction is permanently cancelled." I can't just write a receipt on a whim," Gable protested weakly. "I need official company letterhead." John Callahan stepped right into Gable's personal space, towering over the landlord. He leaned down, his voice a low, rumbling threat. "You're going to write the receipt, Thomas. And then you're going to send a maintenance crew out here by Monday to fix the plumbing under this trailer. Because if I ride out here next week and find a single drop of water leaking, I'm going to come visit you at your office in town. Do we have an understanding?" Gable nodded frantically, all color drained from his face. Yes, understood." He scrambled over to the police cruiser, pulled a pen from his breast pocket, and began writing furiously on the back of a parking citation Deputy Miller handed him. When he was done, he handed it to Big Jim with a shaking hand. Big Jim read it, nodded, and handed it up to Annie. "Keep that safe, Mom." "And Thomas?" Gable froze halfway to his truck. "Yes? Get the hell out of our sight." Gable and his movers piled into their pickup truck and sped out of the trailer park, a cloud of desert dust kicking up behind their tires. Deputy Miller, realizing his presence was no longer required, offered a stiff nod to Big Jim, got into his cruiser, and slowly drove away, leaving the 500 outlaws alone with the Davies family. With the immediate threat of eviction vanquished, a surreal calm settled over the suffocating heat of the Barstow trailer park. The Chrome cavalry didn't disperse. Instead, heavy boots hit the dirt as kickstands were deployed in unison. 500 massive engines clicked and pinged as they cooled. Men in leather vests began pulling bottles of water from their saddlebags, effectively turning the desolate dirt road into a heavily armed, surprisingly respectful block party. Liam remained frozen on his porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the towering figure of John Callahan, then down at the black fiberglass helmet, overflowing with cash. "I don't understand," Liam whispered, his voice trembling. "I just fixed a cracked fuel line. It took me an hour. This is thousands of dollars. You didn't have to bring an army." Big Jim Lawson, the silver-bearded club president, sat heavily on the warped wooden steps, groaning as his bad leg protested. He patted the empty space beside him. "Take a seat, Liam." Liam glanced at his mother. Annie nodded, wiping a tear from her pale cheek. Liam slowly descended the steps and sat beside the imposing outlaw. When John got back to the San Bernardino clubhouse on Tuesday, Big Jim began, his gravelly voice carrying clearly over the crowd. He told us about a kid who knew his way around an Evo motor, a kid who refused a $100 bill because of a code of honor his daddy taught him. Big Jim unbuttoned his leather vest and pulled down the collar of his t-shirt. Spanning his collarbone and disappearing down his chest were thick, jagged burn scars, stark against his weathered skin. "John said your dad was a long-haul trucker who rode an old shovelhead. Died a few years back. September 14th, 2023. Massive pile-up on Interstate 15. Liam felt the blood drain from his face. "How do you know the date?" "Because I was there, son," Big Jim said softly. The chatter in the street died down entirely. "I was riding point. It was pouring rain, a semi-jackknifed, and cars piled in. I went down hard and got pinned under a burning sedan. My leg was crushed. The fire was spreading." Annie stepped out onto the porch, a hand clamped over her mouth. "People were running," Big Jim recalled, his voice tight. "But not your father. This giant of a man jumped out of his Peterbilt cab, grabbed a heavy steel crowbar, and sprinted straight into the flames. He jammed that bar under the burning car's frame and lifted it just enough for 2 other drivers to drag me out. 10 seconds later, the gas tank blew." Tears freely spilled down Liam's dirt-smudged cheeks. "I was in a coma for a week," Big Jim said. "When I woke up, I told my brothers to find the man who saved me. But by the time we pulled the police reports, we found out he didn't make it. Another truck hit the wreckage while he was trying to pull a second driver free. His name was Arthur Davies." A profound silence blanketed the yard. Liam's father hadn't just died in an accident. He had died a hero. "Arthur wasn't a patch holder, but he bled for us. That makes you family," John Callahan interjected. He reached into his pocket and placed a heavy, familiar object in Liam's trembling hands. It was his father's silver antique pocket watch, the one Liam pawned to Earl Higgins for $40 just a day prior. "A little bird told us you visited Earl's pawn yesterday." Big Jim smirked, a dangerous glint returning to his eye. "About 40 of us paid Earl a visit this morning to discuss his predatory lending rates. He decided to return the watch. He also decided to donate his entire cash register to the Annie Davies Relief Fund." Big Jim pointed to the helmet. "That's not just rent, Annie. It's yours." Before Annie could speak, a massive biker named Wrench stepped up to the porch, "I run Inland Empire Customs," Wrench said, offering a hand like a catcher's mitt. "I need an apprentice. Paid, under the table till you're 18. You keep your grades up. Come down on weekends, and I'll teach you how to build engines from scratch. You got your daddy's hands. Don't waste 'em." Liam stood and shook the giant's hand, gripping it hard. "Thank you, all of you. Thank your old man." John grinned. Big Jim stood up, put 2 fingers in his mouth, and whistled. Instantly, 500 men stood up, crushing water bottles and moving in perfect unison to throw heavy legs over leather saddles. "We ride!" Big Jim roared. The ignition of 500 engines shook the earth. John Callahan fired up his matte black dyna, threw Liam a 2-finger salute, and dropped the clutch. One by one, the chrome cavalry tore out of the trailer park, leaving Liam and his mother clutching a silver watch, a helmet full of salvation, and a future they thought they had lost. The dust finally settled over Barstow, but the trailer park was never the same. Liam Davies didn't just save his home that day. He inherited a family forged in chrome and gasoline. The Hells Angels kept their word, proving that outlaws sometimes possess more honor than the law itself. A simple act of kindness on a desert highway didn't just fix a motorcycle, it resurrected a boy's entire future. Helen Jenkins emptied her apron pocket, staring at the crumpled $5 bill that stood between her and her daughter's asthma medication. She never expected that parting with her last few dollars to feed a stranded biker would turn her quiet Tuesday shift into a roaring standoff with 150 Hells Angels. The air conditioning unit inside the copper skillet diner had been broken since early July, leaving the air thick with the suffocating scent of frying grease, burnt filter coffee, and Texas highway dust. It was Tuesday, August 14th, the kind of oppressive, blindingly hot afternoon where the asphalt outside looked like black water. Helen Jenkins leaned against the laminate counter, a damp rag clutched in her pale hands. She was 28 but looked older, the exhaustion carved into the fine lines around her eyes. Her shift had started at 6 in the morning, and the tips in her apron currently amounted to exactly $7.45. It wasn't enough. Her 5-year-old daughter, Chloe, needed a refill on her albuterol inhaler by tomorrow, and the pharmacy in town didn't take promises. Behind the grill stood Bob Henderson, the diner's owner. Bob was a barrel-chested man with a perpetually flushed face and a temper that flared faster than a grease fire. He ran the copper skillet with an iron fist and a deep-seated suspicion of anyone who didn't live within a 10-mile radius of the diner. The bell above the glass door chimed, shattering the lazy afternoon silence. The man who walked in seemed to swallow all the light in the room. He was towering, easily 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block the doorway. He wore heavy, scuffed leather boots, faded denim, and a thick leather vest adorned with the unmistakable winged death's head patch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. A jagged, faded scar ran from his left earlobe down to his collarbone, disappearing beneath a tangled, silver-streaked beard. Old Mr. Higgins, nursing a lukewarm tea in booth 3, suddenly found his crossword puzzle intensely fascinating. The 2 truckers at the counter stopped their quiet murmuring. The tension in the room spiked, tight and vibrating like a guitar string about to snap. Helen swallowed hard, wiping her hands on her apron, and stepped forward. "Afternoon," she said, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it steady. "Just you, sir?" The biker looked down at her. His eyes were a startling, pale grey, sharp and entirely unreadable. "Yeah," he rumbled, his voice sounding like tires on gravel. "Just me. Booth in the back." He walked past her, the heavy scent of motor oil, stale tobacco, and sweat trailing behind him. He slid into the darkest corner of the diner, his back to the wall, eyes scanning the exits. Helen grabbed a laminated menu and a glass of ice water, approaching his table with measured steps. "What can I get for you?" "Coffee, black, and whatever the biggest plate of food you have is," he said, not looking at the menu. "That'd be the meatloaf special, sir. Comes with mashed potatoes, green beans, and a slice of cherry pie. Bring it." For the next 20 minutes, the diner remained locked in a strained silence. Bob glared daggers at the back of the biker's head from the grill, muttering under his breath about thugs and trouble. Helen simply poured coffee, noting how the massive man ate with a methodical, almost desperate speed, as if he hadn't seen a hot meal in days. When the plate was scraped clean, Helen walked over with the check. "That'll be $12.50, sir." The biker reached into his back pocket. His hand stopped. A flicker of confusion crossed his weathered face, quickly replaced by a hardening of his jaw. He patted his front pockets. He checked the inner lining of his leather cut. Nothing. He looked up at Helen, and for a fraction of a second, the intimidating aura fractured. He just looked tired. "I lost my wallet," he said flatly. "Must have rattled out of my saddlebag 100 miles back." From across the diner, Bob Henderson's ears perked up. He wiped his greasy hands on a towel and marched out from behind the counter, his face turning an angry, mottled purple. "Lost your wallet, huh?" Bob sneered, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "That's the oldest trick in the damn book. You bikers think you can just roll into my town, eat my food, and intimidate us into a free meal." The biker slowly stood up. He dwarfed Bob completely. "I ain't looking for trouble, old man. I rode up from El Paso. I lost my leather. I'll leave my watch as collateral. Ride into town, make a call, and bring your money back." He unclasped a heavy, silver watch from his thick wrist and set it on the table. Bob scoffed, his hand drifting dangerously toward the space beneath the cash register, where Helen knew he kept a loaded Remington 870 shotgun. "I don't want your stolen jewelry. I want my $12.50, or I'm calling the county sheriff right now. We'll see how you like the holding cell." The biker's fists clenched. The pale grey eyes went ice cold. The atmosphere in the diner turned volatile. Helen could see the muscles in the man's massive arms tensing. A brawl in the diner would destroy the place, and Bob reaching for that shotgun would end in bloodshed. "Stop!" Helen shouted, her voice cracking like a whip. Both men looked at her. Helen's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the familiar, worn paper of her meager tips. It was the money for Chloe's medicine. If she gave it up, she didn't know how she would face the pharmacist tomorrow. But looking at the biker's scarred face, she saw something beneath the terrifying exterior, a rigid, desperate pride. And looking at Bob, she saw a tragedy waiting to happen. She pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, 2 ones, and a handful of quarters, slapping them down onto the Formica table. "The bill is paid, Bob," Helen said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm covering it." Bob stared at the money, then at Helen, his jaw dropping. "Are you out of your mind, Jenkins? You're paying for this vagrant?" "I said it's covered," Helen repeated, turning her back to her boss and looking directly at the biker. "You're good to go, sir." The biker looked down at the pile of crumpled bills and tarnished coins. He knew what a waitress in a dive diner made. He knew what that money meant. Slowly he picked up his silver watch and strapped it back onto his wrist. He looked at Helen, holding her gaze for a long, heavy moment. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked quietly. "Helen," she whispered. "Helen," he repeated, committing it to memory. He gave a sharp, single nod. "I'm Arthur. They call me Deacon. I don't forget a favor." Without another word to Bob, Deacon turned on his heel and strode out of the diner. A moment later, the deafening roar of a modified Harley-Davidson engine rattled the glass windows, fading slowly into the relentless heat of the Texas afternoon. "You are an absolute certified idiot," Bob hissed, snatching the money off the table and shoving it into his pocket. "You think he's coming back? You think a Hell's Angel cares about a waitress at the Copper Skillet? You just threw away your own hard-earned cash for a criminal." Helen didn't answer. She picked up the empty plates, her hands trembling so badly the silverware clattered against the ceramic. A sickening knot of regret tightened in her stomach. Bob was right. She was an idiot. She had let her fear of a violent confrontation override her survival instincts. How was she going to get Chloe's inhaler now? She'd have to beg her landlord for an extension on the rent, maybe sell the silver locket her mother left her. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. There was no time to cry. The dinner rush was coming. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The sweltering afternoon bled into early evening. The sky above the Texas plains bruised into shades of violent purple and dark crimson as the sun began its descent. By 6 o'clock, the diner was packed with the usual Tuesday crowd, ranch hands, tired commuters, and a few local families. Helen was moving on autopilot, balancing trays of chicken-fried steak and refilling iced teas. Her mind was a million miles away, calculating pennies, terrified of the morning. At 6:45 p.m., the change began. It didn't start with a sound, but with a feeling. A low, rhythmic vibration crept through the soles of Helen's worn-out sneakers. It felt like a small earthquake. On the counter, half-empty glasses of water began to ripple. The silverware vibrated against the tables. Conversations in the diner slowly died out. People looked around, confused. "Train coming off the tracks?" one of the ranch hands muttered, peering out the grease-stained window. Then came the sound. It was a distant, mechanical thunder, a low, guttural roar that grew steadily louder, drowning out the hum of the broken air conditioner and the sizzle of the grill. It sounded like a swarm of angry hornets, magnified 1,000 times. Helen stopped pouring coffee for Mrs. Gable at booth 2. She looked toward the highway. Over the crest of the asphalt hill, about a half-mile down the road, a headlight appeared. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the highway was a solid wall of blinding halogen lights and gleaming chrome. It wasn't just a few motorcycles. It was a mechanical army. They rode in tight, disciplined formation, taking up both lanes of the highway. The noise was apocalyptic, shaking the very foundations of the small diner. Panic erupted inside the Copper Skillet. "Lord Almighty," Mrs. Gable gasped, clutching her purse to her chest. People abandoned their meals, rushing away from the windows. The sheer scale of the convoy was terrifying. As the leaders of the pack signaled, the monstrous procession began to slow down, turning off the highway and crunching onto the massive gravel parking lot of the diner. Dozens upon dozens of heavy cruisers and customized choppers poured in. They circled the building like a wagon train preparing for a siege, cutting off every exit. The dust kicked up by their tires formed a thick, brown cloud around the diner, illuminated by the harsh glare of their headlights. Helen stood frozen in the center of the aisle. Her breath hitched. She counted 30, then 50, then stopped counting when she realized there had to be well over 100 of them. Maybe 150. They all wore the same heavy leather vests. The Hell's Angels. "Lock the doors!" Bob screamed from behind the counter, his previous bravado entirely evaporated. He was pale as a ghost, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "Somebody lock the damn doors!" But nobody moved. They were all paralyzed by the spectacle outside. The roaring engines suddenly cut out. not all at once, but in rolling waves, until the deafening noise was replaced by the terrifying sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel. The dust began to settle. Through the front window, Helen watched as the riders dismounted. They were a terrifying assortment of men, massive, bearded, tattooed, and clad in heavy denim and leather chains. They moved with a chilling, organized purpose, gathering in the center of the parking lot. From the center of the pack, a figure stepped forward. It was Deacon. He had changed his shirt, but he wore the same scarred scowl. However, he wasn't leading the pack. Beside him walked a man who commanded immediate, terrifying respect. This man was older, his face weathered like ancient mahogany, his silver hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. He carried a heavy, silver-tipped walking stick, though he didn't seem to need it. On the breast of his cut, above the death's head, was a patch that simply read, President. The President and Deacon broke away from the massive crowd of bikers, walking slowly and deliberately toward the front entrance of the Copper Skillet. The remaining 150 men stood behind them in utter, intimidating silence, a wall of leather and muscle. Inside, a woman let out a stifled sob. Bob had actually crouched down behind the grill, completely out of sight. Helen's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He brought them back, she thought, panic rising in her throat like bile. Bob insulted him, threatened him with a gun, and now he's brought the entire chapter back to burn this place to the ground. The president stepped up to the glass door. He didn't knock. He simply grabbed the metal handle. The bell above the door chimed, a weak, pathetic little sound that echoed through the dead-silent diner as the heavy glass door swung open. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind them, sealing the sweltering diner off from the roar of the idling highway. William Iron Will Callahan, the president of the local Hells Angels charter, stood just inside the threshold. He did not look like a man who had come for a casual dinner. His eyes, the color of crushed slate, swept methodically over the terrified patrons, lingering on the cowering ranch hands and the empty space behind the counter where Bob Henderson had ducked for cover. Beside him, Arthur Deacon Rossi stood like a stone sentinel, his massive arms crossed over his leather-clad chest. The air in the Copper Skillet was so thick with fear that Helen felt she could choke on it. The only sound was the frantic, uneven hum of the broken air-conditioning unit and the faint whimpering of Mrs. Gable in booth 2. Callahan took a slow, deliberate step forward. His heavy engineer boots thudded against the checkered linoleum floor. He stopped right in front of the counter, planting his silver-tipped walking stick firmly between his feet. "I'm looking for the owner of this establishment," Callahan's voice boomed. It wasn't a shout, but a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the room. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Behind the grill, a pathetic scrambling sound echoed. Bob Henderson slowly elevated his head above the stainless steel counter, his face drained of all color, slick with cold sweat. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad. I'm the owner," Bob stammered, his voice cracking violently. "Listen, whatever he told you, it was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean any disrespect. Take whatever you want from the register, just please don't hurt anybody." Callahan didn't even blink. He looked at Bob with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. A man who cowers behind his grease traps, while a young woman faces the front door, ain't worth the breath it takes to threaten him. Keep your dirty money, cook. Callahan turned his gaze away from the trembling owner and locked eyes with Helen. The intense scrutiny made her knees feel weak, but she anchored her hands to the edge of the Formica counter, refusing to step back. She was terrified, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. But the thought of her daughter, Chloe, gave her a sudden, desperate anchor of bravery. "You're Helen," Callahan stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Helen replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Deacon tells me you bought his lunch today," the president continued, gesturing slightly to the giant man beside him. "Tells me you covered his tab when he realized he'd lost his cut and his cash on the interstate." "I did." "Why?" Callahan tilted his head, his slate-grey eyes narrowing. "You don't look like a woman drowning in disposable income, sweetheart. And my brother here ain't exactly the poster boy for charity cases. So why'd you do it? Were you scared he was going to tear this place apart?" Helen swallowed hard. She glanced at Deacon, whose expression remained entirely unreadable, then looked back at Callahan. She decided the only thing left to do was tell the absolute truth. "I was scared your friend and my boss were going to kill each other over $12.50, Helen said, her voice echoing clearly in the silent diner. "My boss keeps a loaded Remington under the register. Your friend looked like he could snap Bob's neck before he even chambered a round. I have a 5-year-old daughter who needs her asthma medication tomorrow morning. If the police came, or if this place got shut down because of a bloodbath, I lose my job. I lose her medicine. $12 was all I had, but it was cheaper than the alternative." The silence that followed her confession was absolute. Bob let out a strangled gasp, horrified that she had mentioned the hidden shotgun. The patrons held their breath. Callahan stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. The tension was a physical weight pressing down on the room. Then, incredibly, the corners of the president's weathered mouth twitched upward. A low, rumbling chuckle erupted from his chest, echoing loudly in the diner. Beside him, Deacon's rigid posture relaxed, and a genuine, warm smile cracked across his scarred face. "Pragmatic," Callahan said, nodding with deep respect. "I like that. You got grit, Helen. But out on the road, a debt is a debt. Deacon ate your food on your dime. The Hell's Angels do not take handouts, and we sure as hell don't let a hard-working mother sacrifice her kid's medicine for one of our own." Callahan raised his walking stick and slammed it hard against the floorboard. The sharp crack made everyone in the room jump. Instantly, the heavy glass door swung open, and the sea of leather-clad men waiting outside began to pour into the copper skillet. They filed in by the dozens, massive men with road-weary faces, covered in oil, dust, and tattoos. The diner, designed to seat 40 people comfortably, was immediately overrun. They squeezed into the booths, 4 or 5 to a side. They lined the diner counter, shoulder to shoulder. When the seats ran out, they sat cross-legged on the linoleum floor, leaned against the jukebox, and crowded the aisles until there was barely room to breathe. What are you doing?" Bob squeaked from behind the counter, his eyes wide with horror, as his diner was completely occupied by the motorcycle club. Callahan leaned over the counter, grinning fiercely at the terrified cook. "Well, Bob, you run a diner, don't you? My boys have been riding since sunrise. We're hungry." Callahan pulled a thick, leather-bound wad of cash from his vest and slammed it onto the counter. 150 meatloaf specials, mashed potatoes, green beans, and cherry pie. And keep the black coffee coming until the pots run dry. Bob stared at the money. Then at the 150 intimidating bikers staring expectantly back at him. I don't have enough meatloaf for 150 people. I don't have enough plates." "Then you better start cooking burgers, steaks, eggs, or whatever else you got in that freezer," Deacon rumbled, stepping up to the counter. "And we don't mind eating out of to-go boxes. Get to work, Bob." What followed was the most surreal, chaotic, and exhausting 3 hours of Helen Jenkins's life. The copper skillet transformed from a quiet, dying roadside stop into a roaring, high-octane banquet hall. The bikers, despite their terrifying appearance, were surprisingly polite, though overwhelmingly loud. They swapped roaring stories of the road, played classic rock on the jukebox, and drank coffee by the gallon. Helen moved through the sea of leather and denim like a dancer, balancing towering trays of food. She served plates of hastily thawed steaks, massive stacks of pancakes, and every single hamburger bun in the building. When they ran out of clean forks, the bikers happily ate with their hands. When the ice machine gave out, they drank their water warm. Behind the counter, Bob Henderson was undergoing a baptism by fire. Stripped down to his sweat-stained undershirt, he was frantically flipping burgers and frying potatoes, completely terrified that a single burnt piece of bacon might incite a riot. The bikers occasionally shouted compliments to the chef, which only seemed to confuse and terrify Bob further. By 10 o'clock that night, the copper skillet's industrial fridge was completely empty. The grill was scraped clean, the coffee pots were bone dry, and a thick haze of grease and cigarette smoke hung near the ceiling. Helen leaned against the back counter, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her apron stained with ketchup and gravy. She watched as the bikers slowly began to stand up, stretching their massive frames and adjusting their leather cuts. The meal was over. Callahan approached the counter, tapping his walking stick lightly. Deacon walked right behind him. "Best meal we've had since Albuquerque," Callahan said, his voice cutting through the fading chatter. He looked at Bob, who was slumped against the refrigerator, panting heavily. "You cook a decent burger, Bob. Try not to be such a miserable coward next time a stranger walks through your door." Bob just nodded weakly, too exhausted to muster even a sliver of his usual arrogance. Callahan turned his attention to Helen. The president reached into his heavy leather vest and pulled out an old, beautifully worn leather tobacco pouch. He placed it gently on the counter in front of her. "Deacon owes you $12.50, Callahan said softly, "but the club owes you for keeping one of our founders out of a cage today. We take care of those who take care of us." Helen stared at the pouch. It was bulging, tied shut with a thick leather cord. "Mr. Callahan, I can't take this. I was just doing my job. Your men already paid for the food tonight." "That was for the diner." Deacon stepped forward, his pale grey eyes fixed entirely on her. He reached out with a scarred, calloused hand and pushed the pouch closer to her. "This is for Helen, for the asthma medicine, for the rent, for whatever you and your little girl need to get the hell out of this dead-end town and away from bosses who treat you like dirt. Open it," Callahan commanded gently. With trembling fingers, Helen untied the leather cord and pulled the flaps back. Inside was a massive, tightly banded stack of cash. Hundreds, 50s, 20s. It wasn't just a tip. It was a small fortune. "Every man in this room threw in $100, Deacon explained, his voice low and raspy. "That's $15,000, Helen. It's clean money, and it's yours. If your boss tries to lay a single greasy finger on a dime of it, he knows exactly who will come back to collect it." Deacon shot a terrifying glare toward the back of the kitchen. Bob Henderson violently shook his head, pressing his hands against the wall as if trying to merge with it. Tears finally broke through Helen's defenses, spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. She looked up at the scarred biker, then at the imposing president, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the gesture. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank us." Callahan smiled, turning toward the door. "Just take care of your little girl." With a final nod, Callahan and Deacon walked out of the diner. The rest of the club followed, a thunderous parade of heavy boots and jingling chains heading out into the cool Texas night. A minute later, The roaring symphony of 150 motorcycle engines shattered the quiet darkness. Helen stood at the window, clutching the heavy leather pouch to her chest, watching as the massive column of headlights pulled out onto the highway, disappearing over the horizon like a comet tail of chrome and fire. The diner fell dead silent once more, but the oppressive atmosphere was gone. In her hands, Helen held more than just money. She held the unshakable proof that salvation sometimes wore a scarred face and a leather vest. She looked down at the pouch, wiped her tears and smiled. Tomorrow morning, Chloe was getting her medicine, and Helen was turning in her apron for good. Helen's story stands as a powerful testament to the unpredictability of human nature and the quiet strength of empathy. When she looked past the leather and the scars, she didn't just prevent a tragedy. She sparked a profound chain reaction of gratitude. It reminds us that humanity's deepest bonds often forge in the most unlikely places, proving that genuine kindness is a currency respected by all.